Bore da iawn I chi. A very good morning to you. Croeso cynnes I Gaerdydd. A very warm welcome to Cardiff University, both here in the main building and also virtually via Zoom. We had a lovely occasion last night to open the conference, so I don't need to say too much or do too much this morning, other really than to thank everybody for their presence and coming together to rediscover Richard Price. And we're going to begin in Tasmania. We have a number of contributors from across the world in very many different time zones. I think Anthony's just had his supper and is joining us for what for him is obviously an evening presentation. So Dr. Anthony Page is in history in the School of Humanities and teaches on Britain, British, European and American and world history. He's an expert on 18th century Britain and author of Britain and the 70 Years' War, Enlightenment, Revolution and Empire, 1744 to 1815, working with Emma MacLeod in Stirling and Martin Fitzpatrick in Aberystwyth, and they're co-editing an Anglo-Scottish correspondence for Oxford University Press. The first volume of the Wodrow-Kenrick correspondence, 1750 to 1810, appeared in 2020, and three more are forthcoming at over 200,000 words per volume. And in today's presentation, he'll be exploring Richard Price's presence in these papers. So very warm welcome to you, Anthony, and over to you. Diolch yn fawr.
Thank you. Woo. And I just want to start off by saying thanks for inviting me to the conference, and I'm really disappointed I couldn't be there in person. My mother is a Gwyneth Morgan, and her great-grandfather came from the outskirts of Cardiff, and I've never been there, so it would have been great to come over, but the airlines at the moment are charging a fairly sizable sum for flights. It's going to be something like $4,000 or something. Anyway, so here I am, thankful for the opportunity to join you via Zoom though. So I will now just share my screen. Hopefully all the technology works here. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you today just to sort of kick off this symposium, talking to you about the how Richard Price is perceived in the correspondence of James Wodrow and Samuel Kenrick. And I've just got the first volume of our Wodrow-Kenrick correspondence. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. On the slide there, the first one came out 2020. We've currently got the second volume out at the peer reviewers at OUP. Hopefully that comes back in good order, and that will hopefully come out next year. But I'll talk a little bit more specifically about the correspondence as we get going. Just a quick little thing about myself, in the sense, a bit of a gratuitous plug for a couple of publications here. As we said, I published a book some years ago, Britain and the 70 Years' War. I sort of tried to broaden out and do a bit of a synthesis of the impact of war on Britain in the 18th century. But my core area of expertise is the rational dissenters. So those Presbyterians who had sort of embraced Enlightenment values, tried to come up with sort of an enlightened version of Christianity. Based off my PhD on Dr. John Jebb, who was a sort of a London radical, sort of renegade from Cambridge. And so that was sort of the basis of my core expertise, the rational dissenters. When I was doing my PhD research on Jebb, obviously read a fair bit of Richard Price and so on. And I also read the Wodrow-Kenrick correspondence in the Dr. Williams Library and thought what an amazing source it was. And sort of later on in my career, I've then come around to editing that source with those letters with Martin Fitzpatrick. But along the way, I've published a few articles. I published an article on Richard Price and anti-slavery, and the whole issue of slavery. Also one a few years ago on war, public debt and Price's rational dissenting radicalism, where it's an article where I sort of overlap the interest in the impact of war plus the rational dissenters. So that's just a bit of a broad context of where I'm coming from. But so what I want to do with this talk, and in some ways there's not really going to be an argument in this, it's going to be more an exposition of the representation of Richard Price in the correspondence. Now, so just to start off, now I'm not going to ad-lib the whole talk, I'm going to start reading. J.G.A. Pocock called Richard Price the first and original left-wing intellectual in British history, a leading nonconformist rational dissenter and Enlightenment intellectual in London. Price's observations on the nature of civil liberty in 1776 became one of the most widely read and debated pamphlets during the period of the American Revolution. And his 1789 sermon on the love of country provoked Edmund Burke to publish his conservative Reflections on the Revolution in France and on the proceedings of certain societies in London relative to that event. The rest of the title is often left off, published in late 1790. Both the American and the French revolutionaries hailed Price as an apostle of liberty. And in this paper, I want to discuss how Price appeared in the correspondence of two self-consciously enlightened Presbyterians living in North and South Britain. And so here we go over to so just give you a bit of a sense of the sort of geographical orientation of Wodrow and Kenrick and who they were. So here we go to point to the slides. Now, so these two men met at Glasgow University in the 1740s. Indeed, Kenrick witnessed the Jacobite uprising and so on. They're both basically present in Scotland at the time of Bonnie Prince Charlie's uprising. They became very good friends as students at Glasgow University, late 1740s. And then James Wodrow, essentially following in the footsteps of his father, who was a distinguished Scottish clergyman and historian of the Scottish Church, Robert Wodrow, he goes on and becomes a minister at the parish of Stevenston on the coast of Ayrshire, North Ayrshire. You can see he's up the top there. And he basically settles down and has a few daughters and sons and has a family and works his whole life. He basically settles there in 1759 after a few years in the 1750s, moving around a little. Kenrick has a more checkered career, or more mobile career, if you like. He's born near Wrexham in North Wales. He Presbyterian. His father's also clergyman. He goes up to Scotland to be educated at Glasgow, as many Presbyterians did in the 18th century. And he travels up there on a Dr. Williams scholarship. And that's how we've got the correspondence. These correspondence was united following their death, and it was then housed in the Dr. Williams Library in London, where it was preserved through the 19th century into the 20th century. It was microfilmed in the early 80s by an American historian who was interested in what they say about the American Revolution. And it sort of sat there, largely neglected, only sort of used by mainly historians of religion and so on. And that's where Martin, Emma and I are editing this to make this very rich source available to a wider number of scholars. But Kenrick himself, he basically, as I said, born in Wrexham, North Wales. After his education at Glasgow, he becomes a tutor in Renfrewshire. He takes the sons, basically the Milliken family, who have made money out of slavery, investments in the West Indies. He takes both of their sons on grand tours, and both of them die on the grand tours in the early 1760s. So the Millikens then dispense with Kenrick, and he ends up going and settling with a brother down in Bewdley near Birmingham. His brother was running a tobacconist. Kenrick goes into business with him, and then they establish a bank. So they're sort of part of the early history of banking around the Midlands at the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. So again, interesting stuff in the letters on all of that. So that's a little bit about Wodrow and Kenrick. I want to just very quickly talk about the nature of the correspondence before I talk specifically about Price. There's just a couple of images of the letters, their distinctive handwriting. As we said, altogether, the letters total about 500,000 words, of which I transcribed about 400,000 words using using Word dictation function. There's a little bit of problem with the Australian accent at times, but that created our basic manuscript, and then we've been editing the letters since then. Lovely little comment from Kenrick in 1805. He wrote to Wodrow, "Neither do I keep any copies of my letters, but I do most carefully keep all of yours, and often wish I had time to arrange and transcribe them. For I have the pleasure and pardonable vanity to think they may be perused with advantage by some of my surviving friends, and add a gleam, however faint, of lustre to my memory in deserving the correspondence of such a friend." As I've got it at the bottom there, little did he know one day they'd be going into Oxford's scholarly editions online. Right, the scope of the correspondence. Just to give you a sense of what we're dealing with here, It is an amazing and arguably almost unique correspondence in the sense that we've got both sides of the correspondence sustained over 6 decades. They start writing just when they finish up at university in 1750, and they're both sort of moving around sort of southeast Scotland, Glasgow, Ayrshire and so on, as they're trying to, you know, Kenrick's being at tutor and Wodrow's getting his clerical career going. Does seem to have been a bit of depression on Kenrick's side. I think he was intended for the clergy, but he obviously decided he wasn't fit for it. He makes a few comments. There's a little blip period there in the late 1750s where he goes offline for a while and seems to have been struggling with some depression. But then, you know, as I said, and the only other major break is the early 60s when he's on the grand tour and they lose contact. But other than that, it's a sustained correspondence. So what this chart is showing you is essentially every letter and how many words is in each letter. And you can see through the period of the American Revolution, there's one of the letters there, one of Kenrick's letters gets up to nearly 8,000 words as they try to argue out their differences over the American Revolution. But then going on right through the French Revolutionary period, Napoleonic Wars and so on, until they basically both pass away within a year of each other in 1810, 1811. In terms of the frequency of the letters, this one just shows the annual number of letters exchanged between the two friends. Fairly short letters in the 1750s. They're young men in their 20s. They're meeting up pubs now and again to discuss religion and philosophy and so on. Then there's that break. Bit spotty in the late 60s, early 70s, but then they really get a sustained correspondence going through the 1770s right up to 1810. And as I said, there's a really big spike in the volume of the number of letters, often shorter letters, in the mid-1780s when they exchange daughters. Kenrick's daughter Mary goes up and stays with the Wodrows, and then they said she returns with Nellie, one of the Wodrow girls, back down to Bewdley. And so there's basically a year there where there's a lot of letters passing between the families. Okay, so that's enough giving orientation to the correspondence. Let's talk about Richard Price. Now, before I do go on, you'll have noticed that I'm addressing people in Cardiff in Wales, and Kenrick was born in near Wrexham. Just one note before we move on. Kenrick's few comments, he basically doesn't talk about Wales much in the correspondence. My feeling about Kenrick is he's very much got his back to Wales, essentially. He's looking to London, he's looking to the continent, and he's looking up to Scotland, the sort of the hub of enlightenment coming out of Edinburgh and Glasgow and so on. Very few comments about Wales, disappointingly. His few comments that touch on Wales tend to be negative, and his overall attitude appears to be one of indifference. He observed that the Welsh and Scottish Highlanders were very different in character and manners, for which I could easily assign you many reasons. Unfortunately, he did not elaborate. While revisionist historians have uncovered the beginnings of popular protest towards the end of the century, at the level of parliamentary politics, Wales was dominated by landed magnates who tended to support the Crown. Kenrick described the 24 MPs who represented Wales as the, quote, tools and creatures of every ministry. And he could not have thought any better of religion in Wales, as it was characterised by absentee bishops and the spread of Methodism. When a cluster of Unitarian congregations sprang up in the southwest of Wales, dubbed the Black Spot by rival Methodists, Kenrick's comment was revealing. He was happy to see, quote, religious truth coming forth in its native lustre in that remote, obscure Nazareth, end quote. So that's Kenrick on Wales. Let's look at them talking about Richard Price. So I've going to basically what I have to say for the rest of this talk under these basic headings: the American Revolution, Wodrow's visit to London, where he published William Leachman's sermons. William Leachman had been principal of Glasgow and who's the sort of the mentor to, is the man who forged the minds of Wodrow and Kenrick as a lecturer and so on in the 1740s, and maintained friendships right through. And then Wodrow wrote one scholar said that Leachman probably trained about a quarter of the Scottish clergy, moderate clergy in the 18th century. So he's one of those influential figures in the church, in the universities in Scotland, helping to produce a whole generation of moderate clergy who are key elements of the Scottish Enlightenment. Wodrow publishes William Leachman's sermons and includes a memoir of Leachman in it. And Rick Sher, the historian of the book and the Scottish Enlightenment, says that the account in the Wodrow-Kenrick correspondence is the most complete account he knows of the making of an 18th century book in terms of all the correspondence around Wodrow's publication of the sermons. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit, the French Revolution and their memory of Price. So the American Revolution, it was not until July 1775, as news of a large battle at Bunker Hill was reaching Britain, that Wodrow and Kenrick started to debate politics. Kenrick began by noting our whole attention and conversation were absorbed by the conflict, with most of the generous and impartial siding with the Americans. He was clearly expecting Wodrow to write back in hearty agreement because they'd both been formed and had the same principles coming out of their training at Glasgow University. Wodrow responded, however, that he had rowed this summer through a great part of the low country of Scotland, and I do not think there is one in 100 of us who has not espoused the side of the government. Now, historians show that he's basically exaggerating there. There was support for the Americans in Scotland, but clearly more generally, people were siding with the government, even if Wodrow overstated it. Kenrick declared that, quote, "This surprises and mortifies me," and lamented that the spirit of liberty was making slow progress in Scotland despite its high levels of education. He noted that in England, some Anglicans had joined the dissenters in opposing the war, but was, quote, "sorry to hear it whispered that a very warm and friendly letter by Richard Price to his American brethren had been intercepted by the government." With Wodrow adopting a conservative Whig stance and Kenrick a radical Whig, they proceeded to debate which side was right on point of principle, the expediency of government policy, and the nature and extent of support in Britain for the government's coercion of the American colonies. Now, what has become known as the American War of Independence did not begin as a war of independence. It was a civil war, as David Armitage has argued, in the British North America, in which a large minority in the 13 colonies took up arms against the Crown and Parliament. A smaller minority sided with the government, and there was a large chunk in the middle who were relatively indifferent and just wanted to get on with their lives. Wodrow and Kenrick debated this British Civil War at length for 2.5 years, between late 1775 and early 1778, until they argued themselves to a standstill, and the alliance between the American Continental Congress and France transformed the conflict into another global Anglo-French war. Wodrow allowed that upon the general principles of philanthropy, the Americans had a right to be independent, but owing to history, law, and their own interest, they were part of the British Empire. The colonies were not separate states, unlike George III's electorate of Hanover. Sorry, the colonies were not separate states like George III's electorate of Hanover, and everyone acknowledged, he said, that the Americans were British subjects. As such, they were obliged to respect the sovereignty of Parliament, making them, quote, "as much bound as we are to contribute to support of that government which protects them." The king could not grant the colonial legislatures equal status with the British Parliament, Wodrow observed, quote, except you give him what the Stuarts claimed a power superior to Parliament, so referring to the Stuarts in the 17th century and the 17th century revolutions. Now, Kenrick championed the American cause as that of liberty, humanity, and the natural, unalienable rights of mankind. And to help try to persuade his friend, he sent Richard Price's pro-American observations on liberty to Wodrow soon after it came off the printing press in early 1776. Kenrick was keen to persuade his friend, as he could, quote, not think without pain that one of your good heart and enlightened mind should see this cause in a different light to me, end quote. Now, Kenrick claimed that in contrast, the government's case was, Kenrick sort of pointed out to Wodrow, knowing that it might hurt, that in contrast, the government's case was championed, in contrast to Price, the government's case was championed by Jacobites like Samuel Johnson of dictionary fame and the canting Methodist John Wesley. Kenrick argued that the Americans could be both British subjects and refuse to pay taxes imposed by the British Parliament. Indeed, they could only remain British by paying taxes through their own elected colonial assemblies in terms of upholding their British liberties. Now, in response, Wodrow thanked Kenrick for the pains, Wodrow thanked Kenrick for, quote, the pains you have taken to convert me to the American party. While willing to listen to everything that may be said on that side, I am not so much a philosopher as to prefer the honour and interest of America to that of Britain. End quote. Now, as a good Whig, Wodrow acknowledged the right of resistance, but only in response to intolerable tyranny, which he considered far from the situation in the 1770s. Believing that all human governments are imperfect, something we all might agree with him today, Wodrow thought that fierce Republicans like Kenrick and Price had, quote, ideal notions of the perfection of government, which never can nor will be realised, at least until the millennium. Now, holidaying on the Isle of Arran off the coast of Ayrshire in June 1776, Wodrow, sorry, let's move to the next slide. So he's basically holidaying on the Isle of Arran off the coast of North Ayrshire, June 1776. Wodrow was thankful for the gift of Price's observations on liberty. And it's a nice thought of him sitting there enjoying his summer holidays, reading Price's observations on liberty. And his response to Kenrick is worth quoting at length, and I've got it on the slide. He wrote, I have read it once and again. I love and esteem the doctor and could embrace him as a bosom friend. Agree with him in many things, in his general principles that government is a trust placed in the hands of our rulers by the people, and I also will add, with the Apostle Paul, by God Almighty in the course of providence for their good. But I differ from him in many of his applications and unfoldings of his general principle in his idea of liberty of representation, of colonies, and many other things. You get to say, Wodrow wasn't a big one for punctuation. I'm sorry for some things thrown out in the pamphlet which discover a mind either provoked by injury or keenly exasperated by party spirit, and which he himself will be sorry for some years hence when the present heats have cooled. I am grieved for the distress that his and your benevolent hearts must feel from the melancholy imagination that the ruin of your dear country, i.e. Britain, is fast approaching, which seems like a black cloud to hang over your minds and to darken all your views of the public prosperity and felicity. I hope that this is an event as yet far, far, far off, and that even America itself, after the sword is sheathed, will in a few years be in a happier situation than she ever has yet been. But I drop this point and try something else less interesting and more agreeable. And on he goes with the rest of the letter. Now, this passage is a good example of how they conducted enlightened debate and disagreement within their letters. They're really trying to model the enlightened culture of civil, candid, polite discussion and disagreement and sort of groping towards truth through the process. And they're puzzled that they've both got the same principles, they're both educated in the same place, but they're coming to completely different conclusions on this key political event. And so it's one of the things that makes the correspondence fascinating, is an example of enlightened discourse in action. And again, something we might reflect on in today's world of highly polarised and populist politics around the place. Anyway, Kenrick, however, was confident. And sorry, get back to where I am. So it's a good example of that. Now, there is also a touch of irony here, as Kenrick was generally more optimistic, the more optimistic of the two. As I said, he had bouts of what looked like depression as a young man at various times, but generally he's more optimistic about the world, sort of broader progress. He was a keen follower of Joseph Priestley, that other leading rational dissenting philosopher and clergyman and scientist, and as such Kenrick believed that all events, whatever their immediate effect, were ultimately contributing to the progressive improvement of mankind. Now, with the war transformed into another global Anglo-French conflict in the sort of from the late 1770s, the Friends began to focus more on the threat of invasion, with Wodrow complaining about the government's poor conduct of the war and its resistance to raising a Scottish militia, etc. Following the end of the war, Wodrow was, with many in Britain, in thinking that the new United States would soon become disunited. There's a lot of people in Britain thinking, you know, expecting to experience some Schadenfreude watching the Americans sort of all fall apart. There's this idea that you can't have a republic as large as the United States, was a common view in the 18th century amongst political theorists. Kenrick, however, was confident, and he noted that he had also, quote, read their constitutions, those of Massachusetts Bay and the rest, where I find literally verified and established the principles of government laid down by Dr. Price, which have so often been termed visionary and impracticable, end quote. And of course, in the mid-1780s, Price was writing to the Americans. He wrote a pamphlet on the American Revolution, giving them advice both publicly in publications and through personal correspondence with people like John Adams. Okay, so that's Wodrow-Kenrick on Price on the American Revolution. Let's move to London. With the American War ended, the Friends lost interest in politics, along with many other people in Britain in the mid-1780s, and they started to focus on the mutual extended visits of their daughters and discussing the perennial topic of religion. Which is right there in the correspondence, right through, unsurprisingly for two sons of clergymen and one an active clergyman. And Kenrick would sit in his bank reading his Greek edition of the New Testament and comparing the Greek New Testament to different translations into French and English and Spanish and so on. Anyway, Italian, I should say. Again, it's really interesting. Kenrick has a fascination for languages, ancient languages, Latin, Greek, modern languages, French, but we don't have anything there on Welsh. It's a puzzle. Anyway, so, with the American War ended, the Friends lost interest in politics, focused on the mutual extended visits of their daughters and discussing religion. The later focus, the topic of religion, it really centred on Kenrick trying to convince a moderate and sceptical Wodrow that Joseph Priestley's militant Unitarian publications were advancing the cause of truth. They also discussed how Wodrow had helped his friend, a fellow Scottish clergyman, William McGill, to publish his practical essay on the death of Christ, which basically had sort of Socinian, it wasn't explicitly stated, but the Orthodox clergy in Scotland quickly noticed that he was missing out on talking about some key Orthodox doctrines. He was sort of damned by omission rather than what he actually said. And so McGill's essentially sort of leaning in the direction of Unitarianism. And so Wodrow helped him publish the practical essay on the death of Christ, 1786, and then actively defended him in the church courts against the charge of heresy. And this is the second time Wodrow had to do this. He had to defend another clergyman and friend in the 1760s against the charge of heresy. These moderates are, anyway, I won't get sidetracked on that. I've found Scottish religion in the 18th century is fascinating. Anyway, while Price was publishing tracts in the mid-1780s on religion, politics, and so on, he's only mentioned in the correspondence when Kenrick had, quote, a great deal of pleasure in 1787, reading Joseph Priestley's letters on the subject of the person of Christ, which were addressed to a number of people, including Richard Price. And Price and Priestley would often have like friendly exchanges of pamphlets over philosophy and religion. Now, Wodrow travelled to London in late 1788, passing through Bewdley on his way there and back. And this was the only time the two friends met following Kenrick's move to Bewdley in 1765. In preparation for his journey, Wodrow visited the Scottish philosopher Thomas Reid in Glasgow and carried a letter from Reid to his friend and correspondent Richard Price. In London in October 1788, Wodrow found himself among so many persons and things in this new world. I won't try a Scottish accent. While the purpose of his visit was to arrange publication of his edition of William Leachman's sermons, he also dined with the metropolitan dissenting literati and engaged in some religious tourism. Wodrow visited various churches, enjoyed the music of the High Mass in the Sardinian chapel. He twice visited the Portuguese Jewish synagogue to witness their prayers and, quote, chanting during their great feast of the annual atonement, and also visited a house where he was allowed to observe the circumcision of an infant. He met the Unitarian minister, Theophilus Lindsay, who had set up the first Unitarian chapel at Essex Street in 1774. He met Theophilus Lindsay and, quote, had the pleasure of joining in the Reformed English service, as he referred to the Unitarian service, at his Essex Street Unitarian chapel. Wodrow also dined by invitation with Dr. Price, quote, whom I love and revere, he noted, in a, quote, in a company of his own friends, Dr. Rees, Mr. Morgan, Mrs. and Miss Morgan, and the doctor's sister and niece, all Welsh people. The following week, he spent an evening, quote, very agreeably with Dr. Price at his nephew's at Blackfriars Bridge, and got a good deal of intelligence from him of different kinds. He has great hopes for the extension of liberty from the present struggles in France. And that's at late 1788, so it's sort of pre-French Revolution. It's all the contest between the crown and the old financial crisis and so on. Now, the nephew referred to was one William Morgan, an accountant whose home became a place where radical reformers in the 1790s met and sang songs like The Trumpet of Liberty. Inspired by his uncle, William Morgan published tracts and calculations in the 1790s aimed at kindling an effectual opposition to that system of war and profusion which has too long been suffered to depopulate and impoverish the nation. In 1797, Sam Kenrick referred to William Morgan as, quote, the heir of the acute penetration and open, plain dealing of Dr. Price, end quote. Now, Price was a pioneering theorist of life insurance, and James Wodrow helped administer the Church of Scotland's fund for widows and children of clergymen. They appear to have discussed this when they met in London, as upon his return home, Wodrow posted Price the last 3 reports about our Widows Fund. Price in turn thanked him in a letter of January 1790 and noted that he had, quote, bestowed much attention on this fund and held for many years a correspondence with its founder, Dr. Alexander Webster. Price also thanked Wodrow for the gift of William Leachman's sermons and for a controversial sermon in which William McGill defended his book on the death of Christ against the claims of heresy by his evangelical critics. Price wrote that, quote, he was sorry that McGill had been opposed by ignorance and bigotry, but assured Wodrow that, quote, such opposition must be expected and it generally defeats its own end by promoting discussion and spreading liberal and just principles, end quote. So now I'll come to the French Revolution. I'm just going to stop sharing at this point. So the French Revolution. Price had been too ill in November 1788 to preach a sermon on the 100th anniversary of the Glorious Revolution, which was held by the self-styled London Revolution Society. With a revolution then underway in France in the following year, the London Revolution Society held another anniversary dinner on the 4th of November 1789. And by this time, Price was feeling better and he was able to deliver a sermon, and then they went and had a dinner. Now, after the dinner, Price moved that they send an address to the French National Assembly congratulating them, in Kenrick's words, on their steadiness and success. Price sent a copy of the published version of his sermon, A Discourse on the Love of Our Country, to Wodrow, And referring to a lost letter that Wodrow must have sent him, he noted, quote, that he noted that Wodrow in the sermon would see how much I agree with you in rejoicing at the news of the French Revolution. He wrote, a spirit has gone forth which is likely to shake the foundations of the long-established fabrics of superstition and tyranny. So very much echoing what he said in the sermon. Now, in February 1790, the press reported that one Edmund Burke had condemned the French Revolution in Parliament and also condemned its British fans. What bitter, what venomous, what hellish invectives are now poured upon your friend, Dr. Price, Kenrick wrote to Wodrow, underlining your friend. There's a little bit of sort of fandom going on here. Anyway, he seems to smile with sovereign contempt, Kenrick continued, or perhaps pity, for they certainly do not know what they do. Nay, he continues on in his old tract and rouses their envy, malice and animosity to a still higher pitch, in showing every day new instances of respect and veneration from foreigners, which his own countrymen refuse him. Now, Wodrow, Kenrick and Price were on the same page in thinking the French Revolution was a good thing, as were most Britons in its first year. When Burke's reflections appeared near the end of 1790, however, Wodrow was more willing than Kenrick to give weight to some of his arguments. That said, Wodrow still thought that Burke was, quote, a little deranged, and that he had, quote, laid too much stress on prejudice and custom, so much, in my opinion, as to destroy all the difference between right and wrong, end quote. Kenrick replied, as a dissenter, noted or said that Burke had, quote, never liked us or our cause. And it's around this time that the dissenters were campaigning for repeal of the Test and Corporation Acts and so on. And that's their cause at that time. Now, Burke had yet Kenrick allowed that Burke should be thanked for provoking the numerous critical responses to his book, as they were advancing the cause of truth. Burke had brought forward the great work of improvement, he said, for had he not written, what must the world have lost, end quote, as in all of these great books that were written in response to him wouldn't have been written. Now, as my co-author and sort of distinguished expert of rational dissent, Martin Fitzpatrick, has observed, the French Revolution, quote, did not cause the Friends to replay their differences of the 1770s, which would have placed Wodrow in the camp of Burke and Kenrick in the camp of Price and Thomas Paine. With France descending into terror, war breaking out, and reform repressed in Britain, the ageing correspondents had a growing realization that the age they lived in was not as enlightened as they had hoped. While Kenrick remained more optimistic than the prudent Wodrow, both thought that the hand of Providence was sufficiently hidden to cause puzzlement and uncertainty. So they're heading into this new sort of polarizing revolutionary age of war and revolution in 1790s. They're looking for signs that, ultimately good will come out of all this, but they're having a little bit of difficulty at times. For his part, Richard Price died in April 1791, and so did not witness the rise of popular loyalism and the riots in Birmingham directed at leading dissenters like Joseph Priestley. Kenrick noted Priestley's funeral sermon on the death of Price, and also Andrew Kippis, another distinguished rational dissenter in London, Andrew Kippis's oration over Price's grave. And Kenrick observed that, quote, Burke's aversion to this departed saint is owing, I am told, to Lord Lansdowne's, that's formerly Lord Shelburne's, partial attachment, and Lord Stanhope's. Both attended his funeral and were superlatively abhorred by Burke. So, and this is generally known that one of the reasons Burke had a big axe to grind against Price was that Price had associations with Lord Shelburne, later Lord Lansdowne, and so on. Now, Kenrick sent a copy of Priestley's funeral sermon to Wodrow and noted that he had also lent it to a neighbouring man of fortune, who was no dissenter, who was nevertheless a great admirer of Richard Price and also had a great deal of Dr. Price's gloomy turn, end quote. And Price was certainly subject to, his Presbyterian minister is subject to a bit of gloominess at times, as you can see in the journal he kept that was published by D.O. Thomas in an edition of an issue of the journal Enlightenment Dissent many years ago. Okay, so finishing off, remembering Price. In the remainder of the correspondence, Price is mentioned predominantly in relation to religion and war. So there are a few scattered references in the years after he died. Firstly, Price joined the Unitarian Society that was established in early 1791, but may have withdrawn had he lived a little longer. Price was theologically an Arian, and without heading into the theological, terminological swamp of 18th century religion, basically Price and other Arians believed that Jesus was a pre-existent divine being, but separate and subordinate to God. So they reject the Trinity, but they still see Jesus as a sort of a divine being who pre-existed his time on earth. The Unitarian Society, however, soon adopted a strictly Socinian theological platform, as advocated by the likes of Joseph Priestley and Theophilus Lindsay, which declared that Jesus was a human being given a special commission by God. So he's sort of like a super prophet who is then resurrected and exalted following the crucifixion. Now, Kenrick was fully on board with this version of Unitarianism and became secretary of the West of England Unitarian Society. In contrast, as a moderate minister in the Church of Scotland, ministering in a sea of evangelical and highly educated parishioners and so on in Scotland, and a very, you had the popular party, evangelical popular party in Scotland, sort of keeping a careful watch on these moderate ministers who seemed a little bit too rationalist for their liking. Wodrow tended to be much more prudent and cautious and ironic and so on. And so Wodrow disliked dogmatism of any kind, and he thought it a pity that such a liberal-minded society should start upon any narrow or party principles, which will exclude 9/10 of the rational Christians in Britain. He noted that a friend of his, who was an Arian, had joined the Unitarian Society, but was, quote, hurt by their refusal to print any of Dr. Price's sermons. And he was going to remonstrate with them about it. And, quote, if liberty could be obtained, I believe he would be at expense of printing them himself in Scotland. The Arian Price served as a touch point in the long-running debate between Kenrick's militant Unitarianism and Wodrow's ironic moderatism. With Britain at war with France in the years following Price's death, they cited him as an opponent of war. In September 1794, Wodrow referred to war as being, quote, the grand error of nations, as good Dr. Price calls it. 2 years later, in 1796, he again referred to the war as, in the worthy Dr. Price's words, the dreadful error of nations. This quote clearly stuck in the mind, but it was actually not Price's. It was found in a letter of thanks by the president of the French National Assembly to the London Revolutionary Society, a London Revolution Society dated on the 5th of December 1789, and had been published as an appendix to Price's sermon on love of our country. So they didn't necessarily go back and check the origin of their quotations. Now, this passage clearly had a memorable impact, however, as Kenrick cited it again in 1802, but this time he misattributed it to the ex-bishop Talleyrand. This is a good example of the value of the Wodrow-Kenrick correspondence, I'd argue, in terms of studying reader reception in the 18th century. Now, this enlightened correspondence between provincial Presbyterians in Scotland and England arguably provides further evidence of Richard Price's contemporary status as a leading rational dissenting champion of religious and political liberty, which will no doubt be discussed in many other contexts in the course of the rest of today for you and tomorrow. And so that's it. I will leave it there and open up to questions.
Thank you very much. Diolch yn fawr, Anthony. We'll have time for a question or two for Anthony, and then we'll have to maybe just shift the time of the first break a little so Marian has her time as well. Yeah, have you got a question, Marion?
Marion has a question.
Oh, one moment. We have so that everybody can hear you properly, hopefully.
Hi, Anthony. It's Marion. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah. Okay. I'm interested in the daughters. So they're exchanging the daughters, and then they're writing letters about them. Is this exchange for educational purposes? And are they writing about their education, or what is this about? I'm sorry. I'm more interested in the daughters than in price.
Okay, look, you've just opened up a massive topic. I could talk for another hour on this one, so I won't. But it's one of the things I want to write an article on the daughters. The letters are really part of a network of communication between the families. And sometimes Mary Kenrick will add notes, not often, but to Samuel's letters. So you really get the sense of these are letters going between two families. And partly, I think the exchange is just bonding the families. Look, you've got to remember, Kenrick's mother is Scottish. So Mary Kenrick has a strong identification with, Kenrick's wife, Elizabeth, is Scottish. And so Mary has a strong sense of herself as having connections to Scotland. So she wants to get up there and hang out with the Wodrows. And then Nell wants to come down and see England and so on. And when she's down there, she's learning French and she's learning the piano, and there's a lot of this sort of stuff. You get little insights into sort of Jane Austen type world through the letters. But definitely I'm just amazed how mobile those girls were, traveling in coaches. Mary Kenrick was running her own little cider business. They're often sending apples and so on up to the Wodrows. And Wodrows saying, thanks for a barrel of apples, they're really good, etc., etc. So there's a lot of family interaction going between them. And on top of all of that, this is where I'll just leave it, we found Emma McLeod gave a talk in Ayrshire, and someone said, oh, did you know there's a Mary Ann Wodrow kept a journal? It's in an American archive. Turns out it's Wodrow's niece, was living just off the coast of Ayrshire, kept a very detailed journal. And she was best mates with Peggy Wodrow, one of James's daughters. So there's this whole other world just open. I only found this out a couple of months ago. Whole other world opened up. There's a whole thing going on there with daughters. Highly educated. Yeah, I'll stop. Watch this space is what I'd say.
Thank you.
Yeah. We've got one other question I think we can take, if that's okay, Anthony, and that's going to come from Remy in Italy. I can't remember exactly where he is in Italy, but it's looking very sunny there this morning. We'll try and bring Remy in via the Zoom.
Yes, hi everybody. I'm very glad to be allowed to participate remotely. Anthony, I wondered if Wodrow, to what extent Wodrow and Kenrick believed in Price's cosmopolitan ethos, like love of country and all of that, because I've always wondered if Price's view of a cosmopolitan world order was really shared among rational dissenters, and whether there were not rival conceptions of patriotism. So I wondered if the correspondence shed any light on that.
That's a really good question, Remy. I'm just trying to think. So we're just wrapping up volume, the 1780s volume, basically. We're about to embark on the 1790s, where we'll have more. Now, I did transcribe all the letters, but it was quite a few years ago, so I can't tell you. What I would just basically say at this point is Kenrick is much more optimistic about that sort of citizen of the world things. He's a fan of Mary Wollstonecraft. He's a fan of Thomas Paine and so on. So he's much more that sort of cosmopolitan approach. Wodrow is more, you could argue, patriotic and more prudent and, dare I say it, conservative. He's not fully Burkean conservative, but Wodrow leans more, he's just more pessimistic about what's capable of and the depth of national prejudices.
Lovely. Okay, thank you very much, Anthony, and thank you for joining us so late in the evening. I'm not sure how long you'll be able to stay with us today, but it's good to see you, and we may see you again tomorrow as well. Well, I keep on saying I'm sure Price would approve of a conference being brought together, a cosmopolitan worldwide conference brought together through the wonders of modern technology. So yeah, if you can join me in thanking Anthony. Diolch yn fawr.